All right, everybody. Shh. During this workshop, we're going to be discussing silence and solitude, which means for the next 2 hours, we're going to take a nap. Sounds about right, doesn't it? When we think of the words silence and solitude, what images come to your mind? What images come to your mind when you think of silence and solitude?
Be on a mountaintop, looking out over a beautiful vista, and kind of just hearing the wind, maybe seeing a bird fly, and sometimes having somebody there with me, but sometimes not.
Sure. That's a beautiful image. Yeah. Who else? When you think of silence and solitude, what images come to your mind? What do you envision?
I think of monks and nuns, honestly.
Monks and nuns. Okay, that's a fair one. Monks and nuns.
I think of a sleeping baby.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that image. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Lisa?
I think of art galleries.
Art galleries. Oh, I like that. Yeah. That's a good one. Bud?
Because it's difficult, loneliness.
Okay, we're going to talk about that. Anybody else want to share their image? Okay, these are great images. Thank you. Thank you both. So quiet, calm, meditative. I think of early morning, no traffic, no sirens. I live in the middle of town. No kids yelling. I have several neighbors that have small children who it seems like every time they walk out the door, all they do is scream. Early morning lakeside with a fresh cup of coffee. These are things that I think about when I think about silence and solitude. A time and a place to get away from all the noise of this life. My husband, my kids, my grandkids, telephone ringing, notifications beeping on my phone, that constant tone that a new email has just arrived to my inbox. I know most of you can understand, but I can hear this little man's voice in the back of my mind proudly pronouncing, "You've got mail." I think I hear that in my sleep. Just to make it stop, even for a few moments, this is what I think of when I ponder the idea of silence and solitude. Silence and solitude are ancient practices that probably most prominently come to mind when we ponder the life of desert mothers and fathers. Those who have felt like living life in the ancient cities were too worldly. Can't imagine that today, can we? And they gave it all up to retreat further away from the hustle and bustle of the city lifestyle. And then when there were too many pilgrims pursuing these men and women for guidance and instruction, several of them pulled even further away in search of silence and solitude that they so desperately craved. In Scripture, we can find several examples of these practices. Jesus often went away to pray alone. Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. This is where Jesus begins his ministry, 40 days of fasting in the wilderness. Luke chapter 16, verses 12 through 13 says, "Now it was at this time that he went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer with God. And when day came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also named the apostles." Matthew chapter 14 and verse 13. "Now when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard about this, they followed him on foot from the cities." Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 23. Immediately afterward, he compelled the disciples to get into the boat and to go ahead of him to the other side while he sent the crowds away. After he'd sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. Jesus often withdrew from the crowds, from his disciples, to seek communion with the Father in solitude and in silence. It was a time for Christ to rejuvenate, to refocus, ready himself for the next steps of his ministry. These are all wonderful examples for us to follow. But let's be honest. We're all busy people. We have busy lives. We have busy families. And I am certain you are like me on some days wishing you could just escape from it and go live in the desert. But then reality sets in. And instead of running away, we look out the windshield of our car on the way to the next appointment, longing for perhaps just a few minutes of peace and quiet. Moments of silence and solitude are what Christ exemplified for us in Scripture. Temporary reprieves to hear from God, to ready our hearts, and then to come back into the world refreshed, renewed, and ready to face what is to come. One of my absolute favorite examples of this type of silence and solitude can be found in 1 Kings 19. This is verses 1 through 16, and Chris is going to read the scripture for us.
Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a solitary boom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." And he looked, and there at his head was a cake of bread on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your own way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also, you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And you shall anoint Elijah, son of Shaphat, of Abimelech, as a prophet in your place."
Thank you.
That word.
That word.
Yeah.
That word. That was a good word. Elijah had a really hard battle. He was weary, he was worn, and he was afraid for his life, so he ran. Now, God sent an angel to him to give him physical sustenance for the journey he was about to face. God allowed restoration to come to him in the form of food and physical rest. Then when he was ready, he forged ahead on this 40-day journey through the desert to come to the mountain of God, the same mountain that Moses had spoke to God on. I love here in the scripture what God asked Elijah. What are you doing here? Why are you here? Elijah tells God how he's feeling. He's honest. He's it. All that's left, and he feels alone. God calls him to come out of the cave and stand before him as he passes by. I think it's safe to say that Elijah had been experiencing an immense time of solitude. And now here, when he's called to stand before God, Elijah endures this great wind that was stirred up, but God's not there. Then an earthquake that shook the very ground that Elijah was standing on. Again, God's not there. Then a fire, hot and raging. No God. But then a gentle breeze came. And here it was that Elijah recognized the sound of God in the stillness, in the silence. God repeats the same question to him. What are you doing here? Elijah responds with the same retort. I'm it. I'm all that's left. I've been extremely zealous for you, and now they want my life. It's here that we find Elijah, who's been physically refreshed, is now receiving mental refreshment from the words of God, as God gives him instructions on what he's to do next. In the next few verses of this chapter, God assures Elijah, you're not alone. There are others in Israel who have not abandoned God. And now that you've received this time of renewal and refreshing, it's time to get back to work. This is where we find ourselves today during this time together this week. We're learning about how to better prepare ourselves and truly reflect on and enjoy those moments that God gives us for renewal and refreshment. We're going to continue learning about silence and solitude and hopefully learn some new tools on ways to refresh ourselves so we'll be ready to face the world once again. But before we do, we're going to do another activity. In the back of your journal, you should have a piece of paper in an envelope. Now, we are social creatures. We don't often like to be alone. Some people quite honestly fear being alone, which is why they crave the noise and the crowds of the bustling cities. I grew up out in the country, but I have met some city people who have told me that no city lights and the sound of crickets freaks them out. They just cannot possibly imagine. They are so used to the constant bombardment. Some people fear silence or being alone because they're afraid of what's up here. They're afraid of their own thoughts. Still, some people fear silence because they're afraid that God's not going to speak to them. So to put this into perspective for us, we're going to begin our activity time by taking the piece of paper and writing about things that you may fear about silence and solitude. No one else is going to see this, so I want you to be brutally honest. This is one of those reflective moments. Maybe you're one of those people that you don't like to be left with your own thoughts. Perhaps you're like me, and part of the fear about silence and solitude is that you're not productive the way the world sees it. So right now, during our productive time, we're going to look at ourselves, reflect on what things you really fear about silence and solitude, and I want you to write those on the paper. We're going to give you about 7 minutes or so to really think about this.